So, Rabotai Karim, we are now entering a new segment in this war of Amalek, which is from the sefer of Rav Elchanan Wasserman, and we're going into segment number 3. In the section number 3, Rav Elchanan Wasserman quickly addresses this question of whether history is going to repeat itself. Is it what we call in the Middle East maktub, meaning it's written and therefore it will be, or we can do something about it? The answer is both. The answer is both. How so? Rav Elchanan Wasserman says, Ve'ine, here we have our sages have taught us the key to all of the stories of the Torah. Mafteach lekol sipurei Torah. There is a key lesson to be learned from all of the stories that are mentioned in the Torah. Whether it's the story of Adam ben Chava in creation, fighting against the serpent, falling for the trap, whether it's Cain and Abel getting into a fight and ending up with the first murder in history, or it's Yaakov going and with his family back to his father's house and on the way having to meet with Esav. Obviously, all of the enemies that Am Yisrael had in Egypt, the Exodus, Moshe Rabbeinu fighting against wicked Jews that decided that they want to take the leadership position, and on and on and on. We have throughout all of our Torah different battles, different stories, different lessons that can be learned. But Rav Elchanan Wasserman is saying with all of those stories, there is one key element that perhaps we don't know, we forgot, we didn't realize, or we simply didn't pay so much attention to it. And he says, Maasei Avot Siman Lebanim. What is Maasei Avot Siman Lebanim? What the fathers did is symbolic of what the children will do. As the Midrash Rabbah says in Bereshit, 7th section, the 7th chapter, in the 6th segment, 6th paragraph. Maasei Avot Siman Lebanim means whatever our forefathers went through, so will their descendants. In so many words, all of the stories of the Torah are not just there to tickle your fancy and entertain you because you have nothing else to do. It's not a history book. It is not something that is just going to be there for mental stimulation. It's not even there simply to just teach you laws, because many times the laws are not taught within the stories, but rather around the stories. So why do we have the stories? Says the Midrash Rabbah that Rav Elchanan is bringing. Maasei Avot Siman Lebanim. Everything that our forefathers experienced in the Torah, so will their descendants. Their descendants doesn't mean just Avraham had 2 sons. He had, of course, Yitzchak, his favorite, the one he loved, the one he adored, the one that Am Yisrael came from, and he also had Ishmael. Ishmael that, although he did tshuva, many of his descendants are our mortal enemies today. No, it wasn't just those descendants. And it wasn't just Yaakov and the 12 tribes. No, it wasn't just them. It wasn't just Moshe Rabbeinu and Am Yisrael at Mount Sinai. It wasn't even just David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, his son, and his great descendant Chizkiyahu, who was a big tzaddik. No, it's not them. Who are these descendants? Us. What happened to our forefathers will happen to us. These stories in the Torah are each there as prophetic messages of what will happen in the future. And therefore, if one studies these stories the way that our holy Jewish sages taught them, they will literally have the clear instruction set of how to overcome these obstacles, the very same obstacles that our forefathers dealt with. And just like you have this here, Rav Elchanan Wasserman says, furthermore, now that we know that whatever our forefathers went through, so will their descendants, we also know that Maasei Amalek siman lezaro v'nimtzenu lemedin mizeh. We also know that just like our forefathers experienced things we're going to have to experience, the same thing is happening with Amalek. Whatever Amalek did in the past, so will the Amalek descendants of today, they will do now. Ki haosim leachis hen mizera Amalek. Here, Rav Elchanan Wasserman gives us a couple of extraordinary details that are the foundation of this entire shiur, and needless to say, are the foundation of this whole series. Here, Rav Elchanan Wasserman is telling us that while it's nice to know that we are all Jewish people connected to holy sages, to holy forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, it's not going to do you any good if you didn't learn anything from them. And what can you learn from them? Their experiences. Why do I need to learn their experiences? Because eventually, at the time of Mashiach that we're living in right now, the era of Mashiach, the same things will be repeated. Just like Amalek went and fought Am Yisrael, they will fight again. So how did it go? We had Mount Sinai. But Mount Sinai didn't just appear out of nothing. First we were in Egypt, slaves, agony and pain. 210 years. That was really supposed to be 400 years. But the suffering that Am Yisrael had in Egypt was so bad and so magnified and so much worse than the original permission that Hashem gave Paro, that Hashem cut the time in half practically. Instead of it being 400 years, it was 210, of which the last 116 years were the worst. But after HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Egypt through miracles and a strong arm, which the sages called a super miracle, not just a miracle, but a super miracle we discussed in previous shurim, Am Yisrael got to Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, where there was another very big test of our emunah, our faith in Hashem. It was another time that the enemy attacked and did not give up. It was another time that we overcame the obstacle by going with Hashem. And 49 days later, we arrive at Shavuot, which is at the time we received the Torah. The Torah protected us. But if a person thinks that that would be enough, then perhaps the Tanakh would have been finished already there and we would already be all in Gan Eden. But it wasn't. Because shortly after we received the Torah, we went to Refidim and rested over there, near the water in Refidim. We rested, the Torah says. The word Refidim comes from the word Rifyon, which means being lackadaisical, resting from the Torah, resting from our servitude of Hashem. And as soon as we got to the Refidim, Amalek came and attacked us. Amalek traveled nearly 2,000 miles just to come attack us, unprovoked, for no good reason that would ever make sense to anybody else. All of the reasons we discussed last week, which is Amalek came to fight against Am Yisrael because that was their way of fighting against Hashem, fighting against the belief in Hashem. So all of what happened in the past are lessons for us to know for today, for the future. And says Rav Elchanan Wasserman that this Amalek is going to do the same thing again. Despite the fact that we had, after 2,000 years of being in the exile, we were able to immigrate in larger capacity to the land of Israel. Many people, and myself included, have misspoken to a certain extent, making it seem as if there was no Jews in the land of Israel for 2,000 years. This is completely false. There's always been Jews in the land of Israel. It's just that the majority of us were all over the exile. In Europe, in the Middle East, all over the world. But in the mid to late 1800s, about 160 years ago, many more Jews started immigrating to the land of Israel. And shortly thereafter, a bunch of secular, anti-God, atheist, communist Jews also decided to join them as well. And in 1948, according to the Gregorian calendar, you had the founding of the modern state of Israel. But this and many, many more Jews immigrated to the land. But this does not mean that, again, there was no Jews there. Nonetheless, this was a miraculous event, even though there are some tzaddikim like Rabbi Yaron Reuven that says this was a bad miracle, not a good miracle. There are such things, that there are good miracles and there are bad miracles. But because of all of the issues with the Zionists and the anti-Torah people, which we'll discuss today. But nonetheless, we do see that to a certain extent, there was an exodus. We do see to a certain extent there was a Yam Suf, a near annihilation event. Obviously, the Holocaust, the horrors of it, and other things that have happened to us over the last couple of thousand years. There was an elevation in the world of Torah over the last couple of decades, especially, where there's many more people doing tshuva. But what we are seeing now, more than what we've seen in many decades, is a war against the Torah by Amalek. A war against the Torah by Amalek. In essence, we're seeing history repeat itself. Just like the Torah says, it will repeat itself. And therefore, the lessons of the past are not there for us to know the information in order to eliminate the possibility of war, but rather to enable us to win the war, enable us to have the tools needed in order to win the war. And Rav Elchanan Wasserman continues and he says, V'shamati me'akadosh ba'al Chofetz Chaim. I heard this directly from the holy Chofetz Chaim. He was his rabbi. Odot Yevtsektia. His testimony over the Yevtsektia. And he says a statement in Yiddish, which I'll translate to English. And the Chofetz Chaim says about the Yevtsektia, it's clear that these Yevtsektia, are the seed of Amalek. Yevtsektia are the seed of Amalek. Where is it coming from? The Chofetz Chaim. Now, why is it so important to know that Chofetz Chaim said such a thing? For anyone who doesn't know, Chofetz Chaim never said a single word out of his mouth that was forbidden. There was no gossip, there was no lies, there was no lashon hara. He's obviously the one that wrote the sefer about lashon hara, the ultimate sefer about lashon hara. So careful with his speech, so careful with his behavior, so careful to give the right honor to those that deserve it. But here the Chofetz Chaim does what many people would never imagine him doing unless they learned his books. Chofetz Chaim makes a bold statement. Yevtsektia is Amalek. Who is Yevtsektia? Was it a bunch of Nazis that ran the Holocaust? Was it a bunch of different Mohammedans that started chopping off heads? Who was the Yivseksya? Yivseksya, Rabotai Yekarim, was the general name for a Jewish organization. Again, Yivseksya was a Jewish organization of RCP, Revolutionary Communist Party of the Bolsheviks, where the communists had created a national section to implement the communist ideology among their own. Who's among their own? Meaning the Jews forced other Jews to become communists. Communists mean anti-God, atheist, war against God. So the Yivseksya Jews fought mercilessly to destroy Judaism by closing synagogues, closing mikvehs, forbidding kosher slaughter, and putting anyone who taught Torah in jail, and even killed them. Here we see the historical testimony of Rav Zilber in his sefer called To Remain a Jew, pages 37 to 40, where this Yivseksya were Jewish people, as far as the halacha is concerned, but they were the biggest enemies of the Jews to such an extent that the Chofetz Chaim stated, Yivseksya, they are Amalek. Rav Zilber said the same thing. Yivseksya is Amalek. So here we see, Rabotai, that Amalek is not necessarily always a Gentile. Amalek could also be a Jew. In fact, there are many different types of Amaleks throughout the last couple of 100 years that many people don't realize they're Amalek. They even learn their material and admire them. Karl Marx was the father of the scientific communism, but yet he had Jewish parents. Karl Marx, in essence, declared war against God and motivated and inspired millions and millions of people until today to declare war against God. There is no doubt that he was part of Amalek. We have a Phil Marshall Milch, who was one of the Nazi leaders, whose father was Jewish, and his mother then said that the real father of her 6 kids is her dead uncle, who she cheated on her husband with. Meaning that this Phil came from an intermarried Jew and became one of the biggest enemies of the Jews. Edgar Jacobi was a Jew from his mother and father and was actually a former Hollywood producer. Left Hollywood and ended up joining the Nazis. Fought for the Nazis to beat France in May of 1941. Karl-Heinz Larvey, also a Jew that was raised actually in a religious family, but hated the Torah to such an extent that he created a false identity and ended up joining the SS, the Nazi army, and fought for Hitler against his brothers and sisters, killing them. Unfortunately, Rabotai, many people don't realize that not all Jews were on the same side during this time. In fact, a documentary that is by Dr. Brian Rigg, a historian, showed that there was 150,000 Jewish soldiers fighting for Hitler, meaning on the Nazi army, killing their brothers and sisters. This may not surprise some of you that have been watching my lectures for the last decade or so, but it certainly is a surprise to many people that think that perhaps only the non-Jews were bad. In fact, there were some non-Jews at that time that were better than some of the Jews. Some of the non-Jews helped the Jews stay alive while some of the Jews killed other Jews. Of course, the majority of the enemy were non-Jews, but nonetheless, Rav Elchanan Wasserman is telling us here something that we have to take into account. Amalek is not always going to be the obvious-looking enemy. Amalek will sometimes be hiding in plain sight. And if we're not aware of how to identify Amalek, he could literally be living under the same roof as us, and we wouldn't know. So the first thing that Rav Elchanan Wasserman is telling us is, know this, as careful as the Chofetz Chaim was about every single word that ever came out of his mouth, to the point where at 100 years old, he never lost a single tooth. And he attributed this to never saying one word out of his mouth that was not allowed. Over 100 years old, still has all of his teeth. No root canals, no cavities, no nothing. And you certainly can't contribute that to genes at that age, even if you have the best genes. He says the holiness of his mouth even protected his body. So here he's saying there are some Jews that are Amalek. They were in the past, and unfortunately there are some today. How can we identify them? Should be the next question. Rav Elchanan Wasserman gives us that first sign. It's not the only sign, but it's the first sign that for sure someone is Amalek. What is it? He brings the Gaon Mivilna. The Gaon Mivilna gave us details of Amalek, the different parts. But one of the things that he taught us also is that Amalek osim leachis. They are not the types of sinners that go against God just because they desire something. They're not going to go against God just because they desire a girl or a boy or all types of other things. Today, unfortunately, you have to say, both, because you're not really sure who you're looking at anymore. I went to the store today, and to be honest with you, I was confused. I wasn't sure who was behind the counter, which gender they were. It's very, very difficult to be in a world like this. But nonetheless, if you want to identify Amalek, it's much easier than identifying gender today. How? Amalek makes sins specifically to anger God. They're not just doing it for desire. They're doing it to anger God. They're looking to fight a war against God. And therefore, the Gaon Mivilna is brought in a sefer called Even Shlema, that Rav Elchanan is bringing here, in a section or chapter called Chevle Mashiach, the birth pangs of Mashiach. And he says this, Erev Rav dvukim me'od be'Yisrael, v'Yisrael omdim ima'asein. As it is written, v'yit'arvu ba'goyim v'yilmedu ima'aseim. The Gaon Mivilna, over 200 years ago, had the wisdom of Torah that can only be compared to the sages of the Gemara. Something unbelievable. And he brings us something very simple here. He says, the Erev Rav, which is one of the parts of Amalek, they are glued. They are glued to Am Yisrael. Very much glued to Am Yisrael. What is it like? It's like a peel. You know, there are certain peels on a fruit or a vegetable that are very easy to take off. Very easy to take off with it. An onion peel or the like. There are some peels that, you know, they're not necessarily so easy to take off. You can't do it with your hands, but you could easily peel them off with a knife or a peeler of some kind, like an apple or, a orange or so on. Still easy to peel off. But then there are certain fruits or vegetables that their peel is so connected to the fruit or vegetable that the vast majority of people simply eat the peel. Forget about your vitamins and nutrients. This is not a health food, and it's not a health lecture. Point being is, some people eat the peel, even if they don't want the peel. Why? Because the peel is so connected to the fruit and vegetable that it's almost impossible to take it out without exerting too much effort to the point of aggravation. He says, that's Erev Rav. The Gaon Mivilna says, that's Erev Rav. Erev Rav is so connected to Am Yisrael that unless you're looking carefully and you have the right ideological lenses, you will not even notice that they're there. You will not even notice that they exist. In fact, the danger here, says the Gaon Mivilna, is as the sages teach, V'Yisrael lomdim Maasei, and Am Yisrael learns the actions of the Erev Rav. They learn the wicked behavior of the Erev Rav. As David LaMelech taught us in Tehillim 106, verse number 35, V'yitarvu b'goyim v'yilmedu mima'aseim, that Am Yisrael got closer and assimilated with the nations and learned from their actions, which obviously was the opposite of what the will of Hashem was. When we are connected with people that are anti-God, we could easily become anti-God ourselves, chas v'shalom. Now you would say, okay, so I won't go next to those people that are anti-God. I won't go next to Karl Marx. I won't go next to Lenin. I won't go next to Stalin. I won't go next to Hitler. I won't go next to all those anti-God people. So no. Some of those anti-God people, they're so close to you because they don't look like they're anti-God. They may even talk favorably about God. They may even pretend to be religious. But I can assure you, they're against God. And that's the difficulty. He says, the Gaon Mivilna, there are certain types of Amalek that are much easier to identify. We're not talking about the ones that are so close that they are like this peel, that you don't know if he's a good rabbi or Erev Rav. Some are clearly the enemy, but some are difficult to figure out. So what about the clear ones? The clear ones are the ones that make sins in order to anger God. What's an example? Says Rav Elchanan Wasserman, Ve'em ha'ashirim alizeh ge'ava. These are the rich moguls, the rich people the rich Jews that are full of pride and simply use whatever money they have, resources they have, power they have, to go against God, to go against the Torah. Some obvious examples are like this menuval rasha, despicable excuse of a human being, George Soros, his son, and anyone that's connected or supports him. And I wish he was the only one that was an enemy of God, enemy of the Jewish people, enemy of society. But unfortunately, there are many others in Hollywood, in business, all over the world. There are people like that. Some are in the front scenes, some are behind the scenes. What do you think? These protests that are going and more anti-Semitic than anything we've seen in the last 80 years, they're funding themselves? These kids still call their parents, asking them for $50 so they can buy lunch. So, of course, these protests and everything that's going against the Torah, going against the Jewish people, going against society, this is being funded by people. And it's not just one person, it's not just two people, it's not just three people. Unfortunately, there are many enemies of God. And some of them are Jews. And therefore, says Rav Elchanan, אי אפשר להפריד את הערב רב רק על ידי קושי הגלות. He says the connection of Erev Rav to the Jewish people is so close that you cannot separate them from each other without the difficulties of the exile that we're in. In so many words, difficulty, hardship, tribulations, horrible situations, Holocaust, pogroms, inquisitions, protests, anti-Semitism, poverty, disease, whatever it is. All of the horrible things we've had in the last couple of thousand years are a necessary evil that is required in order to separate us from the Erev Rav. In fact, if the Erev Rav was the only enemy and there was only one sect of them, this would be a pretty short lecture and a series. But there are 5. Says the Gaon Mivilna, there are 5 different types of Erev Rav inside Israel. 5. What are these 5? What are these 5? Ribono shel olam, we were just petrified to the point where we wanted to start crying about ourselves and our misfortune when we heard about the Soroses of the world, the horrible ones that are causing so much animosity. You're telling me there's 5? Yeah, there's 5. There's 5 different types. Chazal brings in the Tikkunei HaZohar, page 41b, the 5 different groups of the Erev Rav souls. These are called Nega Ra, evil affliction, which stands for the 5 groups, the Nun for Nephilim, the Giborim, Anakim, Rephaim, and Amalekim, Amalek. We're not going to go too deep into each one, but briefly, this Erev Rav is not just anybody that just showed up one day. This all started at the time of Cain. The time of Cain, the time of the flood. In fact, the sect of Amalek that's alive today are the reincarnations of the evil souls that were destroyed during the flood of Noach. The sect of Erev Rav that we also find in the world today came from the Erev Rav that joined Am Yisrael during the Exodus. Who are these? These were the Gentiles that pretended that they wanted to convert to Judaism. But how do we know that they were all Erev Rav? Because they never really intended to convert. These Gentiles were the sorcerers, were part of the sorcerers of Paro. And they thought that Moshe Rabbeinu was the ultimate sorcerer, and that's how he brought all the plagues. So they figured that if he's able to destroy the Egyptians with his sorcery, they might as well join him and become better sorcerers and learn the sorcery from him. These were the Egyptian sorcerers that joined Am Yisrael and became part of the Erev Rav. And the Gaon Mivilna writes in the Even Shlema that the Nephilim are those who are constantly involved in immorality, pedophilia, pornography, all the filth of the world. The Giborim are those who seek to gain honorable names for themselves, even if they are religious and want or even succeed in building synagogues and yeshivot and donating money for sefer Torah. They are only doing it for the sake of their name, hence Gibor. Gibor is like a hero, but really a hero in his own eyes. All they do is to build their own names. They are connected to the wicked, the Tower of Babel. Then you have the third segment, which is the Anakim. Those are the wicked ones that ridicule Torah scholars. They're specifically those that go against Torah scholars. Like some of these wicked Reshaim in the media, in Israel, in America, and around the world that have nothing better to do other than mock the Jewish world, the religious Jewish world, and how the Torah scholars live and how the religious community functions, as if there's no other problems in the world. All they want to do is write and mock the Torah scholars and the Torah community. They're called Anakim. The fourth one are the Rephaim. The Rephaim are those who decide that they do not want to support Torah, and in fact, they abandon all types of kindness and charity that has to do with Torah. They're willing to donate to feed people. They're willing to donate to a zoo, to build a cage for the new lion. They're willing to save some, nearly extinct butterfly that's fluttering around somewhere in Africa. They're willing to do that. But Torah, they simply refuse to do it no matter how many millions of dollars they have. And then you have the fifth group, which is the Amalek. Amalek are those that are in the leadership position, the heads of nations, the heads of government, the heads of organizations, specifically during the time of exile, and specifically those that take advantage of poor Jews. And one of the ways that they take control over people is by creating machloket, creating disputes, fights between different Jews, different segments of Jews. And the Zohar Kadosh says in the first chapter, or first volume, that with these different types of Erev Rav, the Nephilim, Giborim, Anakim, Rephaim, and Amalekim, the Amalekim are those that came from the time of the flood. They're reincarnations of the evil souls from the time of the flood. And they themselves were reincarnated to become the leaders by force. They're not people that are qualified, good people, smartest people. No, usually it's the opposite. But part of the function that they have in the world is to be the wicked leaders. The Nephilim, on the other hand, are called Nephilim because they constantly fall for immorality. All of these people you see that are being exposed for being, immoral, pedophiles, and all the LGB and all the other stuff, they're part of the Nephilim. Nephilim meaning falling ones.